All right, so here we begin lesson 3, where we're going to look at two sections of the textbook. One deals with empire across the globe, and the other realism in the 19th century. We're going to look at one text from each of these. There's a couple reasons for that. One is I didn't want to assign too many texts this week because your paper is due at the end of the week. And then the other reason being that for the realism section, we're going to look at Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground, which is a text I'm really excited about. Dostoevsky might be my favorite fiction author. He's right at the top of the list, and it's a really wonderful text, but it's longer than anything else we've read, and it's also a novella, basically a short novel, so I can't really cut out part of it the way I could with, say, Faust, where you can read several scenes from a play and get a feel for it. You really have to read the whole thing or you'd be missing crucial parts of the plot that are necessary to understanding it. So this is kind of the Dostoevsky week. We also already read Flaubert, A Simple Heart, which was from the realism section of the book. So you're getting a good dose of realism. In the empire section, this particular section of Empire at a Crossroads in the book is from a period when colonization was still happening as the world was being colonized. And we only have 3 writers in that section of the book. Like I've said with other examples before, if we were spending a whole 10 weeks, like a normal quarter on this class, we would read all 3 of those authors because they're all excellent. But we just don't have that kind of time. Although what we'll learn about empire here, as we started to talk about in the past lesson, will be influential all throughout the class. And in lessons 5 and 6, we'll look at several what we call post-colonial writers who are writing after the colonial period has ended as some of these countries have started to gain their independence. And so colonialism will really be with us all throughout the class, even though the section on empire here is very brief. It's looking at a certain period of it when the colonization was still happening. All right, so let's dive right in, and we're going to start with this section. At the crossroads of empire. So the 19th century bore witness to more imperial expansion than nearly any other time in history. You might be thinking of the Roman Empire right now, and in terms of the amount of the globe an empire covered, the Roman Empire was second only to the British Empire, but the British Empire reached its height in the 19th century. And other countries, France, Spain, Portugal, were really just conquering parts of the world during this time. So even though you have lots of empires in the distant past that conquered lots of places, in terms of an effect on the modern world and how 19th century imperialism changed the modern world, we're really looking at the 19th century here and all the sweeping changes that happened with this just mass conquering of different places throughout the world by the superpowers that existed at that time. And one thing that goes along with having an empire is maintaining it, which is not easy. It's costly and difficult. You have travel, administration, wars, supplies. The textbook gives lots of reasons for this, but you have to have, the bigger something it is the harder it is to maintain. You have the people you're colonizing who will rise up and rebel. You have the people from your own country that have to live and work there. So an empire is just incredibly difficult to maintain. Well, why is this important to learn? Emperors needed to persuade their subjects to the value of the mission of empire. In other words, if the British Empire or the French Empire wanted to maintain their empire and maintain those resources they needed to administer it, they had to convince their subjects it was worthwhile. And this is where literature comes onto the scene. If you've taken classes in British literature that cover the mid to late 19th century, you will see that an incredible volume of British literature was composed to justify imperialism. And this is a time, you know, after the revolutions we talked about in the last lecture, where people are kind of starting to wake up to the idea empire is, not a good thing. And so Britain really had to, and the other ones as well, really had to justify it. And so it's interesting to look at the literature that does justify it and examine the rhetoric there and see the flaws and the problems with it, but also how the writers made their arguments, as well as the literature that responds to it and critiques it. There were lots of the long-lasting results from this 19th century imperialism. I mean, we've been talking all throughout this course how we're living in a modern world today, and we're looking at writers from 1650 on forward who have shaped and changed the world so that the modern condition in which we live is hugely influenced by these past writers and cultures, and we're seeing those influences borne out over the course of this class. Imperialism is one of the biggest factors. This 19th century imperialism really made the modern world. And so what are some of the things that are left from that? Well, a global interconnectedness, the way we interact with countries all throughout the world, whether that's through trade or tourism, the idea of kind of one country being isolated, except in really remote parts of the world, is not an idea anymore, and that's a modern thing. Before modernity, before this 19th century imperialism, with some obvious exceptions, countries were much more isolated from each other. You also have severe economic inequalities. As you can see, the differences between first and third world countries, those are more present now than ever because of colonialism. So what are some of the examples of this? As I mentioned, France and Britain were two of the biggest empires, although Portugal also conquered a lot of places. And as the textbook points out, the U.S. even got into the game, even though it was a very young country toward the end of the 19th century. France had an incredibly huge presence in Vietnam. I mean, if you go into a Vietnamese restaurant today, you still see, French words on the menu, and you can see kind of the combination of French and Vietnamese cuisine in both of those, in Vietnamese restaurants. And so you can still see the influence today. And the textbook goes into a little more detail with all the horrible things that happened while France was occupying and controlling Vietnam. Africa, which is one of the biggest, I think, after Asia, the second biggest continent in the world, 90% of it was controlled by different colonial powers. And this is one of the example of empire at a crossroads, the title for this section, because you had these different countries, these different empires fighting over control of different areas. One example of that that's not in the textbook is the island of St. Lucia in the Caribbean. It changed hands back and forth between Britain and France dozens of times in the, I think, 300 or 400 year span before it finally gained its independence. Derek Walcott, a writer who we're not reading because he shows up in the British Literature Survey, but who it does appear in our textbook later on, is from St. Lucia and has a great epic poem he wrote in 1990 about the British and French occupation of St. Lucia, and he actually compares the island to Helen of Troy because the two superpowers were fighting over her. And as I said before, the Britain Empire was just massive. You've heard the quote, "The sun never sets on the British Empire." They actually conquered 1/4 of the entire world during the 19th century, as the textbook points out. Let's come back to this idea of how, in order to maintain an empire, the emperors or the leaders of the empire had to persuade their subjects that the mission of empire was worthwhile. How did they do that? Through literature and writing. And so the rhetoric of much of that literature was one of racial difference. Basically, the imperial powers saw themselves as superior to the inferior primitive races they were conquering, and they weren't doing it for the economic benefits or any of that. They were doing it to help these poor people who were uncivilized and needed their civilization. So there's this condescending, patronizing rhetoric that's very much a part of imperialism and tries to justify the imperial mission. And so you can see the flaws obviously in that, and that's one of the reasons why it's so good to read this literature and to go back and examine that relationship. And with Tagore, it's really interesting because we get to see a text produced under colonialism by a local writer, whereas most of the texts we see are post-colonial ones, or ones written by the colonizers during that time. Seeing one written by someone who lived in the colony during that time is really interesting to look at. And so obviously there was a huge hypocrisy that was part of this rhetoric of racial difference. A really, really traumatic example from the book is King Leopold of Belgium. Belgium was another imperial power I hadn't even mentioned yet. They enslaved the Congo Free State just for access to the rubber trade, of all things. So much of this had to do with resources in certain countries. And they claimed to be going there for humanitarian and scientific reasons, and what they did to the people in the Congo was just awful. Of course, colonial subjects, they could rally themselves with literature too. And of course, they wanted to stand up to the colonizers. And so as the 19th century went on, you had lots of wars. This one famous example is the Indian Mutiny of 1857, which was incredibly violent. And Britain had this long relationship with India. I mean, Queen Victoria and the monarchs after her up through the mid-20th century were called either the Empress or the Emperor of India. They had this complex relationship with India, where India was like the prized colony of the British Empire. But the rising up by the Indian soldiers. That was incredibly violent, but the British response was even more violent. And if you look at the literature around it, you see just how the literature surrounding the Indian Mutiny really reveals how horrible colonization was. Because you had writers like Charles Dickens, who was, adamantly opposed to slavery and racism, actually writing pieces in defense of Britain because he was so horrified about how the Indian soldiers had gone about their mutiny and how many British people they killed. But then you see the British response is even worse. And there's actually a really good book on the subject by one of my favorite writers, Christopher Herbert, called War of No Pity. And he connects the literature being produced at the time, such as Charles Dickens's A Tale of Two Cities, to the Indian Mutiny. And the title of that book alone should tell you what that war was like. And that's just one of many examples. War of No Pity. Finally, really the idea to think through here is that word crossroads. You had, on one hand, it illustrates how you had various imperial powers fighting over these territories and resources, but also how the empire was really at a crossroads. You have subjects starting to rise up, both through physical force, like in the Indian Mutiny, and through literature, like with Tagore writing a story like Punishment, when India and Bangladesh were still British colonies, and him going on to win the Nobel Prize. So things were changing. And eventually, like after World War II, when so many of these countries expended so many of their resources in the Second World War, they were basically just out of resources. And because, like I said earlier, maintaining an empire was so difficult, these countries began to gain independence. Big one was India gaining independence in 1947, right after World War II, and then Nigeria in the 1960s, so on and so forth. So let's look at Rabindranath Tagore, a writer from India who wrote in the Bengali language of Bangladesh. India and Bangladesh are right next to each other, and see an example of a writer living through this experience we just talked about in writing a story within that context. So he was the first Asian to receive the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1913 for his poetry, but he was as close as you can get to a Renaissance man since Goethe. I wouldn't probably call him a Renaissance man because pretty much everything he did was in the arts. He didn't overlap into science or politics like Goethe, but he did pretty much everything you possibly could in the arts. Um, Plays, poetry, novels, um, music, all kinds of things, painting. Um, so he was also known for his other works of art, even though he won the Nobel Prize for poetry, but as well as is for an educator. He came up with systems of education that are still used today. And he's what we like, again, like Goethe, he's what we call a cosmopolitan. Someone who did not think of themselves as being from just one country and is more of a citizen of the world. And so, in terms of world literature, he's probably one of the most influential writers of world literature because a lot of these writers were very influential in their country, and we're looking at writers from various countries, and that's why this is a world literature's class. But he really lived the experience because you can go to very different places all over the world and still see his influence. He was born into a very famous family and grew up in a stimulating cultural environment. The textbook lists all the achievements of his grandfather and father and siblings. His siblings he was the most famous one, but they also were very successful artists and writers, but also took part in the reformist activities that he was a part of. And so they call this period late colonial India because it's the end of the 19th century. And by the mid 20th century, not long after Tagore's death, the India would be free. Just about 6 years after his death, India would gain its freedom. And so there was much reform going on that he and his siblings took part in during his lifetime. Incredibly prolific. From 1891 to 95, he wrote 42 short stories. He basically invented the short story genre in India. People didn't really write short stories there before then. He also basically invented the genre of realism in India. You'd seen it in other places in the world, like where we've observed it, but he was like the first Indian realist. But he lived long enough. He overlaps from realism into modernism, so he also invented the aesthetic modernism movement in India. The amount of things he created and poured out into the world that were innovative and new, just overwhelming. There's very few writers of his accomplishment. He was given British knighthood. I don't remember the exact year, but just a year or two later, in 1919, he then rejected it because there was this incident where the British massacred a number of Indians who were protesting. And so you can see his integrity there as well. Like I said, he overlapped into different arts. He wrote 2,200 songs that constitute an entire genre of South Asian music that's now named after him, Rabindra Sangeet. And so, I mean, I want to look this up. I never have. I should listen to it. And India and Bangladesh have both used his songs as their national anthems at one point because he was from India, but he wrote in the Bengali language. And I mentioned before his global influence as a cosmopolitan. I mean, the education system in the Czech Republic still uses his pedagogical approaches. And there's a beautiful bay in Hungary that's named after him. His plays were performed in Ireland, and James Joyce actually saw one of them on a rare trip back to Dublin because he didn't live in Dublin much of his life, Joyce, and said it was one of the best plays he'd ever seen. And so, I mean, the Czech Republic, Hungary, Ireland, still influential today. A guy from Bangladesh has places named after him in Hungary. He has his educational system being used for the school system in the Czech Republic. I mean, and we're reading one of his short stories, and he was the first Asian author to win the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1913. I mean, are you kidding me? All right, let's take a look at this story. So what this story, I think, does best is two things. One is it paints a picture of what life was like in the British colonies during colonialism. And we can see that as very real or authentic because we have a writer from that place writing during that time, not a writer from that place looking back who didn't live through it, and not a colonizer. So that perspective is incredibly important. And then two, the idea of punishment and who is really the one being punished here. I talked in that very first lecture about how one of my goals for this class is for the literature to shock and awe you a bit, to be surprised by some of the cultural differences, and to realize we can't grasp in our totality how a culture is different from us. We can't grasp it in its totality, not all of it, but we're going to learn more about it. And so the very first time I taught a world literature class, I'd never read this story before, and I was reading it, preparing to teach, and it had that effect on me. I think it's kind of gave me the idea to approach the class in this way, that we're continuously surprised and shocked when we read, because the conception of what is punishment here is so different. And part of that is the context, the setting, which is in British colonial environment. So the central theme of this story is either judgment or punishment. I'd use either term there, but really the title conveys it in asking who is punished and why. Those are the central questions for this text. An important concept to understand for this text is the idea of Rashomon, which, if maybe you've seen it if you're a film buff, but the 1950 film, Japanese film, which was one of the first Japanese films to gain national acclaim. It's a classic by Akira Kurosawa. It's called Rashomon. The same thing happens in there, in Rashomon, that happens here. Not the exact same, but similar, where you have kind of this horrific incident, and you have multiple witnesses to it, but each witness gives a different story. You see this phenomenon different times throughout literature and history, but there wasn't really a term for it until Kurosawa's film, Rashomon, which gave it a term. But here Tagore really makes that kind of the centerpiece of his story. The fact that people are telling their version of what happened differently is kind of like the driving force of the plot. It's what moves the plot forward. This is very much a work of realism. It's realistic in style, organization, and effect. It's a story that feels vibrantly real. There's nothing kind of supernatural here where you have to suspend your disbelief. And at the same time, it's shockingly real in the Jameson sense of the term realism, as this is maybe not what we expect. And we're kind of woken up to seeing what life was like in India or Bangladesh during British rule. The narrator, because it's a very realistic story, is omniscient and voracious. The narrator is the source of truth here. And in an almost Flaubertian sense, the narrator does not intrude much, but just a little bit. And every time you hear the narrator coming through, you're like, oh, this is the truth, because the characters aren't telling the truth. So with the whole Rashomon idea, eyewitnesses produce both dishonest and truthful accounts. They both tell the truth and lie as they're giving different versions of the story. And here, this next bullet point is really what's most important about the Rashomon idea, is that reason cannot lead to justice. In other words, if you think about like a court case, like a criminal case in the courts, you should theoretically be able to look at all of the evidence, put together a very logical, rational explanation, and see who the perpetrator or who the criminal is, and arrive at punishing the correct person. But when Rashomon comes into play, you don't have like the DNA evidence. You don't have the other pieces that can definitively say this is the perpetrator. You also then you have to rely on eyewitnesses. And the problem is eyewitnesses aren't always reliable. Why? Because they're human beings. And in this case, we see the ill effects of that play out. So reason or logic cannot lead to justice, and you have subjective accounts. And so you have the person who's the authority then has to choose which subjective account to believe, in this case is a English colonial official, because it's the judge in an occupied, colonized country at the time. It doesn't technically say in the text he's an English colonial, but all evidence points to that being the case. So two kind of things going on here with the realism is it's social realism, as in we see what marital relationships and class relationships between different social classes are like in that society, but it's also psychological realism. Without telling us the character's thoughts in more than just a few sentences, Tagore brilliantly really exposes us to what's going on in their minds, and that's part of what's so fascinating about this story. And like I said before, with the psychological realism, that really leads us to what I said before is the most important question here is who receives the greater punishment? There's one kind of obvious choice on the surface, but if we push deeper and think about the psychological realism, I think the correct answer is the less obvious one, I would say. So we'll look at that as we move through the text here. All right, so the plot, is fairly simple. Two men go out to work each day. It's a familial structure in Bangladesh where they live together and their wives and their children, they all live together as part of the social realism. There's this kind of piece of context that the wives are always fighting and everyone can hear them fighting while the men are at work. And then one day the men have a horrible day at work, so they come home. And in anger, one of them kills his wife. And in not knowing really what to do and kind of just reacting in the moment, the brother-in-law then blames his own wife, and we see the fallout from that. So what are some of the most immediate passages that are most eminently important? I want to look at two scenes in particular. One is when the landlord comes and arrives to collect the rent and discovers that the wife has been murdered. His interactions with Shadem really reveal the psychological realism in how the character's reacting, and then the final scene when the punishment is decided. So I want to look at those two parts, and in the middle, kind of through this first scene, explore Shidam and Chandara's relationship, which is central to the story. The story is really about them. It's really about Chandara. I would say she is the protagonist, even though we see most of it from Shidam's perspective. And then the other brother and sister-in-law are kind of there in the landlord and the judge to kind of propel the story forward. They're the kind of essential pieces for moving the plot, but it's truly about Shidam and Chandara, and really Chandara, I would say. So one of these observations from the narrator that I've alluded to that I think, really gets at the heart of what the story is about says, when immediate danger threatens, it is hard to think of other dangers. Cheatham's only thought was to escape from the terrible truth. He forgot that a lie can be even more terrible. A reply to Ram Lochan's question had come instantly to mind. He had blurted it out. So he doesn't really want ever to blame his wife. This is not a story about a man who sees an opportunity to get rid of a wife he doesn't like. As the text tells us, and we'll look at some of this language soon, he has a challenging relationship with his wife. She challenges him, perhaps in a way he does not want to be challenged, but he really does like her and want her to keep her as his wife. I don't know if I would say he loves her, but she's an attractive, appealing, intelligent woman that he likes to have as a wife. So his plan here is not to bring his wife down. It's something he blurts out in the moment because he's so worried about what's going to happen to his brother. And then seconds later, he's like, oh my gosh, what have I done? Because that's what he says. He says this, and then immediately he drops to his knees and begs Ramlachan, how can I save my wife? How can I save my wife? And so you can see the psychological realism there. You can see the disconnect between what he does in a moment and then what he would have done, if he had, we'll get to that. But what he does in a moment and then how he immediately regrets it. And so when he immediately regrets it, Ramlachan says, where Ramachan was the village's chief source of advice on legal matters. Reflecting further, he said, I think I know a way. Run to the police station, say that your brother returned in the evening wanting his food, and because it wasn't ready, he struck his wife on the head with his knife. I'm sure that if you say that, she'll get off. So this scene, or this quote, has just delicious irony, because this is what actually happened. And Ramachan doesn't know that, but he's just saying the most logical thing. If you were trying to get your wife off, because Cheatham is saying, how can I help my wife? This is what you would say. And so the irony of it is brilliant. Like, he's actually telling the truth, but he thinks he's lying. And so you can already start to see the Rashomon taking effect. More on the psychological realism, what Cheatham says in response to this, he felt a sickening dryness in his throat. He stood up and said, Thakur, if I lose my wife, I can get another, but if my brother is hanged, how can I replace him? And laying the blame on his wife, he had not seen it that way. He had spoken without thought. Now, imperceptibly, logic and awareness were returning to his mind. So here you see the thought process. He's just worried, so he blurts something out. He then regrets that. But when the kind of sensible character here, the one who's objective, who doesn't have a personal stake in this, gives him an alternative, he then realizes that he can't save both of them, and so he picks one, and he uses kind of his logical reasoning here. It's this very kind of like patriarchal thing. He's only seeing his wife as an object, not as a person, not that he would want her more than any other woman. And so it's kind of a sexist response, but it reveals his thought process. And so here through all of this, you really get the psychological realism. You get the Rashomon. I mean, he's already flipped his story like twice here, and even the landlord has provided an alternative story. And so you see these major themes of the text coming through in this passage. Before looking at the end of the story, I want to look at Chandara's character, because like I said, I think she's really the key here. She's the most important character in the text, and this description of her is really interesting. Tagore, like any of the authors we read, is so skilled with his words and intentional. Chandara was not more than 17 or 18. She was buxom, well-rounded, compact, and sturdy, so trim in her movements that in walking, turning, bending, or climbing there was no awkwardness at all. She was like a brand-new boat, neat and shapely, gliding with ease, not a loose joint anywhere. Everything amused and intrigued her. She loved to gossip. Her bright, restless, deep black eyes missed nothing. As she walked to the ghat, the river, pitcher on her hip, parting her veil slightly with her finger. So, I mean, this is mostly a physical description, and you can see why she would be an appealing woman to a man, but it's not just a physical description. The way she carries herself comes through here. And then the most important part I tried to emphasize was that her deep black eyes miss nothing. She's very sharp and intelligent. And the Tagore in the next paragraph, he uses the sister who's been murdered, the sister-in-law who's been murdered, as a foil to illustrate just how sharp and intelligent Chandara really is. So when we see Chandara's choice at the end, and the narrator basically says she chooses to go to the gallows. She gets there as fast as she can. Once Cheatham lays the blame on her, she basically does everything she can to get to the gallows as fast as she can. Why would a woman like this do that? Her choices do not fit with this description. I think that's why this story was so shocking to me the first time I read it. But as we'll see in a minute, that's the brilliance of it. She's doing something very intentional here that she wants to do. So let's look at the final two paragraphs of the text. The Rashomon, you can see here in a description of everything that's happened in court. After extensive cross-examination of various other witnesses, the judge concluded that the brothers had confessed to the crime in order to save the younger wife from the shame of the noose. But Chandara had, from the police investigation right through to the Sessions trial, said the same thing repeatedly. She had not budged an inch from her story. Two barristers did their utmost to save her from the death sentence, but in the end were defeated by her. I love the phrasing there. Two lawyers there are trying to get her off from the death penalty. And Tagore doesn't go into detail. He doesn't say what happened, but he says that they were defeated by her. If you think about it and you really look at the text, it might seem at first like Cheatham has the power here. But what really actually happens is Chandara has all of the power in this text. Well, there are certain social restrictions on her that force her to have the power in this way, but she's controlling the circumstances, is what I'm trying to say. And that phrase, "in the end we're defeated by her," drives that point home. You have everyone doing everything they can to keep her from the gallows at the end, even though they initially blamed her. Cheatham confesses. His brother confesses. The lawyers are trying to save her. And so you see the Rashomon. You see these different accounts that, like I said, are both truthful and dishonest at different points. But I think what she does is brilliant. The textbook says that the judge here is, biased because she's a woman from the lower classes, an English colonial official. I think the English colonial context is part of the reason she's in this position in the first place. And in that sense, the story shows the horrors of empire. But I don't necessarily think this judge is biased, because this is the only passage we have about him. And what is showing here is Chandara's story is the only consistent one. She's the only one who never changes her story. And I think he's just making a logical choice. If there's only one story that's never been changed, I'm going to pick that one. So I don't think you have a racist, sexist judge. I think you have a brilliant woman who wants one certain outcome and knows the way to get it. And when everyone else is clearly lying because they're flip-flopping on their story all the time, he picks the one account that's never flip-flopped. So if she's brilliant and she wants this one certain end, what is that end? Why does she want it? And if it is her death, why would she want that? Well, this is what we learn from the story. So that central question, who's the one receiving the greater punishment here? I mean, obviously something horrible happens to Chandara, but like I said, she's ensuring that happens. So even though she receives a horrible punishment, she's hanged for a crime she didn't commit, does someone else receive an even worse or greater punishment? In jail, just before the hanging, a kindly civil surgeon asked Chandara, "Do you want to see anyone?" "I'd like to see my mother," she replied. "Your husband wants to see you," said the doctor. "Shall I call him?" "To hell with him," said Chandara. So, and you can look back. Maybe I should have quoted the passage when Cheatham first tells her, "You have to take the blame." Her reaction there is so telling. I think she realizes, she's so smart, she realizes in that moment that she's gone. It's, a patriarchal society. She's from the lower class. If her husband says she killed this woman, no one is going to stand up for her. And so she knows right in that moment she's going to the gallows. He says, "Oh, I can get you off. Just do what I say. I can get you off." And I mean, I don't think she believes him for a second. I think he's not as smart as he thinks he is, and it's not going to work. The government, the authorities are going to want to see someone punished for this crime, so she knows she's going to the gallows. So rather than going along with his foolish plan, she realizes she can get him back. She can punish him. So which is worse, to be hanged for a crime you didn't commit, or to live with the guilt of framing your wife? Like I mentioned before, Cheatham is this character who, through the kind of the psychological strain in that moment, blurts out something he doesn't want to actually do. He doesn't want his wife to actually hang. He then realizes he'd prefer his wife to his brother if it has to be one of them. So he goes through with what he said, but then he does everything he can to save her. He doesn't actually want her to die. Part of it might be he really doesn't like her, even though she's challenging. Part of it, though, I think, is he'll feel guilty. And now he has to live forever with this guilt. If he were able to get her off, and she weren't executed, then he probably wouldn't have any guilt because he seems like a selfish character. He wouldn't have any guilt over initially blaming her if she were not executed. But by ensuring she's executed for this crime, and she believes there's no way out of that fate in this society, then she can punish her husband. He has to live with that guilt, which is is kind of is a psychological thing. Living with guilt might be worse than dying. That's a theme we see in a lot of texts. Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment kind of gets into that idea. But we should mention before we close the effects of British colonialism, because as I've said, we're looking at a text kind of written from within the colonies by a colonial subject during the time of imperialism. And so you see this immense poverty, right? They have hardly any food, and the men have to work all day. And the class-based society, like I said, the kind of this living in this colonial society is the reason why Chandara knows when, as soon as Cheatham lays the blame on her, that she's going to the gallows. So why not make the most of that and get revenge on him? But we shouldn't forget that if this were in a different context, a context where she had options, she might not have chosen this action, and she's suffers horribly for it. She certainly is punished as well. She just is able to give a greater punishment to Cheatham. And so we get kind of a portrait of what life is like in the British colonies, and the story that on the one hand seems maybe kind of fantastical that this exact set of circumstances would happen. But then we look at the British colonial context and we see the realism of it, the fierce realism of it. This is exactly the type of thing that would happen in colonial context. That's the brilliance of Tagore as a writer.